So thank you very much to everyone who's joined. Please can we just note that this webinar is being recorded. It's just so we can send it out to you afterwards and put it on our blog. So please just note that, but we can't see any of your faces because of the webinar format. Just note that. My name is Anna. I'm part of the inquiries team at the Oxford Professional Education Group here. And we've been running a series of procurement webinars since the start of this year. And today we're doing it on risk with Fiona Wood. Fiona is the head of learning and standards at CIPS, which is the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. And she's led procurement teams across 3 continents, as well as having CIPS fellowship status. So if anyone's qualified for today's talk, it's certainly her. So I'll hand over to you now, Fiona, to get us started.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you on this call, and it's great to interact with students. So I thought, by way of a little introduction, I would give you a little insight into my background. So yes, as Anna mentioned, I've been in practice. I've worked in retail, a number of big retailers from the high street. I've worked in telecoms, the media and public sector. So I've covered a very wide range of procurement contexts. From education and teaching and learning point of view, I have had the pleasure of teaching students in the range of contexts you see in front of you at university, at vocational level, and indeed at secondary level. And I'm very delighted that I'm undertaking some research with Oxford University as part of my DPhil at the moment. And finally, as Anna mentioned, I am an FCIPS member. I've been an FCIPS or fellow of the Institute for a number of years, and it's something that I'm very proud of, and it does enable me to share ideas with colleagues such as yourself. I thought that I would give you a kind of sense of my education heroes, people that I think are really interesting for us as professionals to kind of really engage with. And my education heroes are quite wide-ranging. You may have come across a guy called Simon Sinek, and he is fantastic. I've given you his link here. But one of his particular ideas is to start with the whys, to ask questions, and to always think about the purpose that you're and the reason why you're doing something. And I think that actually when we're thinking about risks, actually really reflecting on what it is that we're trying to achieve and the purpose behind it is a really important facet of our thinking that really helps us get to grips with this topic. I'm really interested in the idea of curiosity, and within procurement we ask hundreds of questions every day of our suppliers, and a guy called Todd Kashdan has done some enormously important work in curiosity, and I've given you his link there so you can go and have a look. Now, Carol Dweck is amazing in that she came up with this idea of growth mindset, which is really being ambitious in your thinking, because actually with that kind of ambitious thinking, you develop beyond the things, your capabilities that you thought were possible. And so I think Dweck's a really important thinker to think about in terms of moving learning forwards. And finally, Vygotsky, who was writing about 100 years ago, but had some very important ideas about how learning happens. And actually, one of his key ideas was learning happens when it's really difficult. Actually, learning when it's really easy is not challenging, and it doesn't make us think. And actually, learning is about creating those new neural pathways. And Vygotsky, his work is talking about challenging ourselves and making ourselves think difficult thoughts. And in that way, we learn so much more. So the purpose of my talk today really is to think about the definitions, sources and strategy, and how you actually might manage risks. And then I thought, well, you know what would be a nice idea is to try to bring these ideas to life. So what we're going to try and do with, if time is on our side, is actually to give you an opportunity for you to reflect on your risk management approach of your own learning. You're clearly people who are highly engaged with your own learning, but you know, when you learn, you're putting yourself out there. It's quite a risky, can be quite a risky kind of endeavor. So let's have a think about putting risk management into life by thinking about your learning. And then finally, Q&A. We'll wrap up just before 2 o'clock. So really, the purpose and the kind of framework of my talk today is really for us to think about risks and risk management in these formats, to look at definitions, the sources of risks, the organisation strategy and their approach to risk, how we might manage risks, and then that all-important review. So we'll just walk through this cycle. In terms of context, yes, I'm honoured to work for CIPS and to represent the Chartered Institute of Procurement. However, the information that I'm sharing is as applicable to other professional bodies that consider risk as a kind of notion that's important to them. So if you're thinking about this from a project management point of view, or if you're thinking about this from a marketing point of view, these concepts are as equally applicable to you. So if we look at the definitions of risk, how can risk be defined? Well, really, I beg your pardon. So the definitions of risk is kind of thinking about levels of uncertainty. What risk is that we don't know for definite whether certain things are going to happen. So a risk is really a quantification or a calculation that looks at how likely is a particular outcome going to happen. Is it very likely? Is it very probable? Or is it less likely? And actually the risk is really how likely these things to happen. There are a number of definitions that different institutes have, but really it's based around this concept of probability. So when we think of the sources of risk, so where do risks come from? Well, they come from lots of different places. There are risks that are internal and there are risks that are external. Perhaps you can think about some of the risks that happen within your organisation. Perhaps your organisation is based in a number of different areas, and there may be risks that come from different parts of your organisation as a consequence. And there may be risks that come externally because of the competition within your marketplace. There may be changes within technology that may be changing your risk profile. So there are a variety of the sources of risks that you can think about. And here is the CIPS procurement cycle. And actually, from a procurement perspective, the 13 stages of the CIPS procurement cycle, in each one of these, there will be different sources of risks. And it's thinking about how can you identify the risks at each part, and then what can you do to mitigate that. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But we also think about these kind of wider external risks as well. And you can think about really there is so much change in the world at the moment, and actually change equals risk. We don't know how how the funeral will go next week for the Queen. There are risks associated with that event for the police and for all the other people involved in that. They need to think about all of those different sorts of risks. There's uncertainty there. At a more societal level, we use this steepled approach. We think about the social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legislative, ethical, and demographic changes that we are subjective to. When we think about these particular sources of risks, we can actually be very clear that actually none of us as individuals or as organisations more generally, can actually influence these steepled type risks. These are external to organisations, and really these are the sorts of risks that we need to be doing environmental scanning on, reflecting on, thinking about, and thinking about how we might mitigate these risks. And we'll talk about management a little bit later, but actually this environmental scanning of how risks or how changes may be impacting your organisation over time is really important within this, this risk assessment. An interesting example over time is that with an ageing population, which is what we have in the UK, clearly our demographics are changing, and that has implications for the school places that we need, the hospitals that we require, and other services that the public sector need to provide. Now, that doesn't happen immediately. It's a developmental thing that happens over time, and therefore this environmental scanning element becomes really important in thinking about the strategic direction organisations need to take. Oh, beg your pardon. The final point I want to come on to is thinking about the risks of the contract and comparing that with the risks in the contract. So when we're thinking in procurement and we're thinking particularly about the contract that we might make with a supplier, there are certain risks that we kind of need to think about in terms of what are the risks associated with that contract in and of itself. So what does that contract do, and in terms of changing the risk profile of the organisation? So that might be in terms of the amount of financial commitment that an organisation may be making over an extended period of time. It may be a particular strategic alliance that's created. That creates a risk of the contract itself. When you contrast that with the risks inside the contract, so this may be that you may be contracting for a particular component, or you may be dealing with a particular supplier, perhaps on an exclusive basis. Clearly, the risk profile of that particular contract has a very particular nature, and that kind of deals with the risk inside the contract. And it's really important within the procurement field for us to be able to articulate and be clear about the risks of the contract and comparing that with the risks that are inherent within that contract. When we move on to organisation strategy, now this is really interesting in that this kind of reflects our organisation's particular tolerance to risk in itself. Some organisations have a high tolerance to risk, other organisations have a lower tolerance to risk. And it's really important as professionals within an organisation for us to have a clear handle on what the organisation's approach to risk might be. So a risk appetite tends to denote organisations that kind of look at all of the risks and actually look at it in terms of, okay, well, we recognise all of these risks that are kind of, that have been highlighted. How much are we prepared, to kind of move beyond those risks and actually take that kind of quite entrepreneurial view of these things? Whereas other organisations think about risks in terms of how much they're prepared to tolerate. And it's actually looking at the risk from two very different standpoints. The risk in itself doesn't change. It's the organisation's approach to that risk. And why organisations have this different approach to risk has quite a lot of bearing, and it's related to the stakeholders within those organisations. So if you think, for example, of a local council, it's a public sector organisation and therefore has a very low tolerance to risk, doesn't really want quite a lot of certainty in their contracts, compared with a very nimble software organisation that may have a much higher appetite for risk, because of the nature of the stakeholders. When you have public sector organisations, they don't want a lot of risk. When you have private sector organisations that are have a very entrepreneurial organisation approach, then they tend to have higher tolerance to risk. So understanding your context and understanding your organisation's approach to risk is very important. This is also borne out, as I've mentioned, around your sector. So, for example, it's typical that public sector organisations tend to have a lower tolerance to risks than private sector organisations, and that's largely because of the stakeholder communities they serve. But also different industries have different risk profiles, and we've seen that actually there's a very interesting risk profile that we can see within the energy sector at the moment. We can see that actually this global price on energy really does make organisations have to think really carefully about their approach to risk. So industry has a bearing on that as well. And as I've said, this really does call to us as professionals to clearly understand our organisation's context, because once we've understood that, then we're able to provide management techniques and the ways of mitigating these risks in a way that's acceptable to our organisation, that actually enhances the organisation as opposed to working against it. So let's now think about the management. So I'm going to, on the next slide, kind of talk about some of the key tools for the management of risk. But you might be familiar with this little box that I've shown here on the bottom left. This is a kind of probability impact matrix. And you may be very familiar with these probability impact matrices. And this is the mechanism by which you score your risks on 2 dimensions. You think about the probability. So how likely is the risk that you've identified? How likely is that to happen? If it's not very likely, you obviously score it pretty low. And if it's very likely, you clearly score it quite high. So this gives you a sense of how likely is that to happen. And sometimes it's quite difficult to work out how likely things are to happen in the future, and therefore it's often something that you do in consultation with colleagues, and you use data to help you determine that score. And then you look at that risk from the perspective of the impact on the organisation. So if this were to come to pass, if this particular risk was to happen, what would the impact be on the organisation? If there's a very little or low impact, that has a score of low score, and very high impacts on the organisation, clearly a higher score. And this in its way gives us a very simple way of identifying or prioritising the risks that are most important, because clearly you're going to be prioritising those risks that are very likely to happen with a very big impact. We'll come on to talk about that more in a little bit. The other thing to think about within the management of risks is to think about your business continuity planning, the extent to which your organisation undertakes activities to make sure that its business continues to run regardless of certain situations occurring. And businesses spend time and money and thought in making sure that they have plans in place to make sure their operations and the operations of their supply chain remain working despite all sorts of risks that might befall them. And you and your teams may be asked to input to these things. And sometimes I'm sure it can feel like a bit of a nuisance, because it's kind of like, well, how likely are these things to happen? But it's interesting, isn't it? We never thought a pandemic would happen a couple of years ago. And so actually it is worth putting the time and thought into these business continuity plans. And then there's also the kind of disaster recovery. So what happens if something, really significant or catastrophic happens? What is the plan? How would an organisation recover from that disaster to make sure that the employees keep working, customers are not impacted, and the organisation can continue to run. All of these things are forms of management of risks and are important for us as professionals to be engaged with. Finally, risk registers. I'm sure within your departments you think about your risks, and certainly within procurement you'll be thinking about the risks of particular risks within your supply base as well, and those would be highlighted using often a PI matrix, as you've seen there. So now I thought I might spend a couple of minutes just looking at a couple of models. So if we just spend a moment looking at this model, top left, assess the potential causes of risks and thinking about how you might identify your causes and how you might recover from risks. This is a kind of nice little model that kind of encapsulates what we should be doing with risk. Well, clearly, we need to do some work to try and prevent the risk happening in the first place. So we need to think about what do we need to put in place to stop that risk occurring. We need to mitigate the effects of that risk as far as we can, and we also need to recover from any risks that occur. And we know in organisations, when you come to to doing new things, these things can be risky. Stuff will happen, so it's about how you recover from those things. So really it is trying to avoid failure and the negative consequences of failure. That's the whole purpose of risk management. When we move on to this next model on top right, this is the failure mode and effects analysis, and you might have you might be very familiar with this, the FMEA model. And I think that this is quite an interesting model for us to kind of identify, particularly in in organisations that have clear processes, to think about the consequences of risks in this way. So you start here looking at normal operations, and then you're thinking about what's the probability of my normal operations failing, and then you give that a priority number. Then if there was a failure to occur, then you kind of assess the degree of the severity. You may use a matrix like the PI matrix we talked about earlier. Then you think about the severity of the consequences, and really importantly, the likelihood of detection. And finally, you think about the effect on your customers, what's going to happen and how are you going to mitigate that. This FMEA model is really helpful in giving you this risk priority number. It's a way of identifying where are your biggest risks and how you might then go about reducing those risks through this kind of mechanism. I've used that a lot in industry, and I have to say I find it a very helpful and simple way of identifying different sorts of risks. So if we look at the model here on these next two models, so we're looking at the PI matrix, which we discussed earlier, that's in the center here, the probability of something, and comparing that with the impact across the top. Actually, if you then look at this model here on bottom right, then we need to think about these risks in terms of you've got your PI matrix. What are you going to do to try to reduce those risks? And you've got a few choices in your armory here. So really, you've got where you've got major risks and you've got a very high likelihood of something happening. Then one of the most important things is to think about is how can you avoid that? The question you need to ask yourselves is, what do I need to do to avoid this very major risk happening with a very very serious consequence? So it's avoidance techniques that's important there. And actually what the risk management activities are designed to do is to drag that risk from top right to bottom left. And each one of those mitigations, bit by bit, reduces the risks away from these very, very high risks to making them much more manageable. So when we then think about, we can also think about failure as a quality issue. This is where we have high likelihood of things happening, but they're small bits and bobs. So this is about really thinking about the kind of risks in terms of what's the source of this risk internally. Is this some form of quality issue? And this is where the FMEA model becomes really helpful. It helps us identify where these failures are and address them bit by bit. In so doing, then dragging the risk further to bottom left. So our mechanisms of how might we then deal with the risks that we've identified? Well, bottom left, we have got this matrix here. These are our 4 options, or major options that we can undertake to reduce risks or to manage risks. We can terminate a risk or through either avoiding it or eliminating a risk. So some of these really significant risks that we've talked about, they're very high on your PI matrix here. Sometimes they are only treatable or contained if the activity is stopped. So avoid the risk, eliminate it, do something quite important to stop that risk occurring. So it might be that you need to stop something, or it might be that you need to start doing something in addition. But it's really important. These are the red risks. There is no option but to eliminate that risk by doing something. You must act. The next option is for us to treat the risk, to seek to control or reduce the risk. So this is thinking more about cost-effective actions, where if you think about the termination risks, this is stop doing this stuff at any cost. This is going to have a very serious consequence on the organisation. Treating the risks kind of brings cost a bit more into the mix, and it's trying to think about cost-effective measures that kind of start to reduce the risk to more acceptable levels. Similarly, we can transfer a risk. We can either take out some insurance, and I'm sure you've got lots of examples of how insurance can be used to mitigate risk, or indeed we can contract out some of that risk as well. So we can actually contract with a third party to help us take on some of the risks. So we might be offering them a contract, and thereby we're mitigating some of our own risks. Finally, we might be tolerating these risks or accepting them. These are where the risks are kind of green, they're tolerable. Clearly, we don't want to have, lots of risks. We want to tolerate them, but we also want to try to reduce them as far as possible. And we need to keep monitoring these green risks as far as we can, because sometimes green risks can escalate, and they can, even though we're tolerating them, there comes a point where we actually need to do something with them if that risk profile changes in some way. So hopefully you can use these models when you're thinking about how you might be wanting to manage a particular risk in your organisation or a particular risk in your work. And finally, we need to think about how has all this risk management gone? What do we need to do differently? So there's a really, really handy cycle here, which is the plan, do, study, act cycle. We need to be thinking about what's gone well, what's not gone well, what do we need to change, and how can we improve things. We spend a lot of time thinking about risks, anticipating risks, and managing risks, and we need to make sure that we're focusing that effort and those thoughts in areas that actually do make the difference. So we therefore need to make sure we undertake that review and we adjust as we move forward. So that kind of ends my little bit around risks. Before we go on, are there any questions? I'm going to ask Anna, are there any questions from anybody at this point, Anna?
Not that I've seen, but if anyone does have any questions, you can either pop them in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to pass to kind of, share them now. We'll be happy to answer them. Just to kind of while we're waiting to see if any come in, I have one for you, Fiona, if that's all right.
Of course.
So you were explaining how some organisations are more cautious when it comes to risks and some are a bit more pragmatic. What would you do if your own kind of view about a risk doesn't align with that of the organisation you're working for?
It's a good question, Anna. And sometimes your sense may be that there is a difference of view of that risk. So as we said, there are different views of the same risk. And if you have a concern about a risk, even though it might well be that you perhaps have a lower tolerance to risk than your organisation, it's really worth chatting that through with your boss and with your stakeholders involved in that particular project. It might be that you can see something that they can't see, hence your concern around the risk being, you're more concerned about it perhaps than they are. And it might be that they can give you their perspective on why it is that they see the risk in a different light. And actually, it's a mechanism by which you can create a dialogue. And actually, that's the way that most risks are assessed and most risks are managed, is through that dialogue between different people. So if you see some misalignment, and even if you do see an alignment, it's worth having those conversations with people. Don't accept those risk assessments on face value. Understand them and interrogate them, because this then gives you the opportunity to create those open dialogues, understand where somebody else is coming from in terms of the risk, because it might be you're working on a different project that might have some learning, and you might be able to add something into that discussion. So it's always worth that conversation.
Brilliant, thank you, Fiona. I've just found out, sorry, I think the chat function was disabled beforehand. I should have just enabled that for everyone. Sorry about that. So if you do have any questions, you now can put them in the chat.
Thank you, Anna. I can see that the chat's working, which is great. So let me just continue then, and then if there are any other questions, we can move those forward. Okay, so hopefully that little bit on kind of risks and how you might manage risks, and a couple of models might kind of help you in your work. I'm kind of really interested in learning, though. Hopefully you're this learning thing's really important to me. So I'm really keen that we now put that risk management into practice. So how about we do this now? This is my kind of little question for the group, really. So what are the risks for you in your learning journey? So I'm now asking you the question, as a student, where do you see the risks for you in your learning journey, and how might you manage these? So thinking about everything that we've talked about today, we've talked about the definitions of risk. So this is this level of uncertainty of outcomes. So it might well be the uncertainty around what am I going to do next, or how my exam results will be. Think about where you see the risks for your learning and how might you manage these. This is my question. So using this kind of model, we've talked about the definition. So what might the sources of risks might be for your learning journey? And this is something really for you to think about, really. So what are the risks, your internal sources of risk? So this might be your the time you have available, the other commitments that you may have that might be taking your attention away from your studies. It might be that you have a new job. What are the external sources of risk as well? So what is your employer's attitude to your studies? What is your institute's attitude to your studies? Are they supporting you in your progression? So thinking about the different sources of risk that you may have, and actually this gives you a really good opportunity for you to kind of reflect on how you are feeling about your learning journey. And sometimes it gives you an opportunity to reflect on the things that you might be worried about as well. So things that might be stopping you learning, it might be that there are things you don't understand and you need to find out particular bits of information. So identifying the sources of the risk in your learning journey, they will be unique to you, is really worth thinking about. Moving on to thinking about the strategy. Now, obviously, in this case, because it's about us, it's not the organisation's strategy, it's about your approach to risk. Now, your approach to risk and your approach to kind of risk management might be, maybe you can tolerate loads of risk, and maybe you're really happy cramming your studies in the last few weeks up towards your exams, or maybe you have a lower tolerance to risk, and actually slow and steady is more of your approach. But actually thinking about what works for you in terms of your tolerance to the risks of sitting exams or undertaking any form of assessment, and really thinking about that for yourself is important. Because once you've thought about how you actually respond to the risks of that uncertainty, it will help you really identify the ways that you can then mitigate and manage that risk. For example, if you are a person that doesn't really like so much risk in their learning, then that slow and steady approach, you might manage it by saying, okay, I need to be doing, a bit of learning every evening, even though if it's a small bit, I want to make sure that I've got a regular time slot each day to complete my learning. If you have a slightly more a slightly higher risk approach to your learning, it might be that you're happy to undertake more of your learning closer to the exam. But let me offer this thought to you. If you recognize that actually you're a more methodical, slow and steady sort of person because your tolerance to risk is lower, and then you leave your studies to the end of your, and it's getting quite close to the exams before you start to study, that creates an awful lot of stress and tension for you unnecessarily. So really thinking about your attitudes to risk and your approach to how you want to do your learning is a very important way of helping you manage what is necessarily a stressful activity in its own right. So we've talked about the management of these risks. So once you understand how tolerant you are to these risks, how are you going to manage them? So, there is always the inevitable, well, I don't know how I'm going to do in my exam. How are you going to manage that? Are you going to terminate it? Are you just going to say, right, I'm not going to do my exam? Are you going to treat it in some way? Are you going to put some remedial actions? What are you going to do to make sure that you do the best you can in your exams? Are you going to be involving your tutors? Are you going to involve your friends? How are you going to actually manage that risk? And then when you get your exam result through and you've done brilliantly, you're going to review your risk management process, and you're then going to think about, okay, so what were the bits that worked really well? Where did I do well? Where did I enjoy it? Where did I find it most stressful? And actually, this is a way of managing your learning going forward, and then improving your risk management approach to the next time that you do a piece of learning. So this is the kind of thing I'm trying to get you to think about. And therefore, I'm trying to get you to then create a little model that looks like this. So in the middle, we've got your learning, and we've got the 4 T's down this left-hand column. We then think about the sources of risk, and you can create this little matrix yourself. You'll be getting the slide deck anyway, so you can complete this for yourself. But you know what? This is a worthwhile exercise. You can do it in groups, you can do it as individuals, but think about the sources of risks that you may have in your learning, and then think about your organisation strategy. This is you. How do you feel about your learning? For me, I'm a I want to do really well. It's important to me that my learning is interesting and very valuable to me at work. So I like to do learning on a kind of slow and steady basis. That might not work for you, but understanding that and being clear in yourself as to what works for you is important. Then think about the strategies you are going to deploy to manage the risks in your learning. What are you going to do? Turn up to, you're going to be reading your study guides? Are you going to be going to regular tutor events? Are you going to be creating WhatsApp groups between groups of learners to support you? Are you going to be doing an essay a week in order to try and practice your essay skills? What are you going to do to help you manage the uncertainties of this learning that you're undertaking? And thinking about that, and if you use the risk profile and the probability impact matrix that we discussed earlier, you'll find that you'll identify 2 or 3 things that will have a really important impact for you, and that will really help you make the best use of the time that you have in your learning, and also help you practice these risk management techniques that we were talking about earlier. So it's about using the knowledge that we've gained in a different context. So think carefully about how you're going to manage your risks. And then finally, on your little sheet, think about how you would review this. What went well in your exam? And that's not just your exam result, whilst that is important. How did you feel about it? What can you remember about the content that you learned? If you can remember nothing, but you've done really well, then there's an opportunity for you to actually work hard at trying to retain learning in your long-term memory as well as in your short-term memory to pass exams. Think about your approach to that learning, and that will then inform you when you approach the next bit of learning that you're undertaking. So in this way, you get an opportunity to put into practice risk management techniques that we've talked about, and actually get the added benefit of thinking about this in the context of your own learning. It's worth thinking about these things, even if they seem extremely obvious to you, because actually just by thinking these things through, you're creating the neural pathways that are associated with risk and risk management, which are perhaps new to you, and you're applying them into a different context. That in itself is learning, and that will help you progress. So whilst we can't do this exercise together, hopefully when you get the slide decks from Anna, you'll be able to do that with your colleagues. But any reflections at this point, either questions, ideas, or thoughts?
Thank you very much, Fiona. I can see that we've got a question from Daniel. He would like to know, if risk is high and not avoidable and PI is high, what would you do in that scenario?
So we've got the probability, so we've got high risk and high impact. So that's what you're asking, Daniel. So what would we do? Well, all the books say that we need to try to eliminate or avoid that risk. So where we've got a situation where there is something very likely to happen and it's going to have a very significant impact in the organisation, then we have some choices to make. We need to consider of the impact and the likelihood, which is higher. Is it going to have a catastrophic impact on the organisation, or is it, where does it sit? So, for example, an example might be there is a cyber attack that you've been made aware of. Clearly, this could have a very catastrophic impact on your organisation. It's very likely to happen, and it's going to have a profound impact on your organisation. A way of avoiding that risk would be to take down your website from the internet for a period of time until that risk is passed. Clearly, there are some implications in doing that. But if that is, if your kind of long-term risks and the probability of this thing are so great, then this is a way of avoiding it. Your objective is to make sure that that thing doesn't occur. So by removing the source of that risk from the organization, then by taking that down, you're reducing that risk down to the organization in that short period of time. And then you will have other mitigation opportunities to kind of make sure that that website can be put up once the risk has passed. Does that help?
I mean, it helps me. Daniel's asked, what would you do if you can't avoid it being the risk, I would assume?
Okay, well, if you can't avoid the risk, then the importance is then to think about. So you need to think about what's the impact going to have on the organisation. So then there's a kind of series of thoughts that you need to have around how can we reduce the impact of this, this certain activity to occur. So what can we do to reduce the impact of this? So it might well be that the organisation may need to take some avoiding action in other ways. So, for example, they may need to invoke disaster recovery plans. They may need to put in business continuity plans. They may need to bring in third parties to support. The point what you're trying to do is to reduce the impact on the organisation and its customers, and you need to think about in each circumstance, piece by piece, how can we reduce the impact of this event occurring? And as I said, it might well be invoking your disaster recovery plans and also thinking about how that's going to impact on your staff, your other stakeholders, your customers, etc. But one thing we do know, Daniel, is that it's the probability of the certainty of anything happening and the impact of it. We're never really sure of how big that impact will be. And sometimes these things feel very big and actually turn out not to be as significant. So it's hard to work those things through. But the most important thing is to work collaboratively with colleagues, thinking about things in a very rational and very methodical way in order to mitigate those risks as best you can.
Brilliant, thank you, Fiona. Just while we wait and see if any more questions come through to the chat, I'll ask another one. I know there are kind of different definitions of risk across different industries. So if anyone knows the Prince 2 project management courses, I know they have a kind of a different definition. They define risk as something that can be positive or negative, like an issue or an opportunity. And I know lots of our attendees here are considering studying a CIPS qualification or maybe already studying one. So where does kind of the CIPS official definition of risk lie?
Well, you're right, Anna. Risks, we tend to err towards the negative, don't we? Risks tend to be tend to have a negative impact, but you're right. Risks can be positive or can be negative. So the CIPS approach to this is very similar insofar as we are looking at uncertainty of outcomes, Anna, and those uncertainties are as likely to be positive as they are to be negative. But I think the kind of risk-based approach that we take in procurement is that where things are uncertain and positive, it generally means that the organisation is going to do, it's a kind of a nice surprise. And actually within procurement, what we are about is recognizing that we're working with third-party suppliers, with contractors on complex projects where negative risks that have a negative impact, have a bigger impact, or because it's likely to cause delays in production, additional costs in some way, impacts on projects more widely. So we tend to take a slightly more cautious approach to positive risks, mostly because what we're trying to do in procurement is mitigate the downside, and try to make sure that we, as far as possible, end up with a smooth supply chain, and with happy customers. And even when things are going well, Anna, that's quite a task, and colleagues on this call will kind of recognise that actually just doing the business as usual and keeping things in balance is a challenge, and therefore managing these negative risks as much as we can really does enable us to then manage for the upside as well. I've noticed that there's another remark here. Shall I lead on this one?
Yes, please go for it.
Yes, okay. So if as a procurement officer you find out a risk, inform your top manager, but they decide to ignore it and press you to go on, what should you do? Okay, well, this is important, and back to the remarks that Anna and I were making earlier, which is thank you. So it's important that you discuss these risks with managers, with colleagues, with stakeholders more widely, and come to a consensus on at least how the risks are being quantified and what the risk mitigations might be. It's important that when you are thinking about risks, it's not just about the quantification of the risk and identification of it, but also what are you going to do in order to mitigate those risks. So it's really important. I think that there's another bit of the dialogue that needs to happen in this this scenario, and that's about, okay, so what are the mitigating actions that we're going to be taking in order to reduce this risk? Because you've told them what's going to happen. I don't know whether or not they're ignoring it, but you need to there's a need to continue, but there is nevertheless a need to mitigate that risk if indeed it is considered to be a risk. And back to our earlier remarks, it is about a dialogue, a discussion as to whether or not the extent to which risks are, identified, quantified, and then managed. And that's a collective discussion. So I would suggest a discussion around those risks, why it might be that your manager may have a different point of view, and working together with your manager around how you might mitigate those risks as well.
Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. There's also another question from Daniel, specifically about CIPS exams. He'd like to know, how would you master the risk in objective response exams? For those of you who don't know, that's a multiple choice exam, as they're marked by computers, and there's no way to get feedback on the exams.
Okay, Daniel, it's a good question, and just to provide a little bit more background to colleagues who may not be familiar with these exams. So the questions are constructed by humans. They are indeed marked by exams because it's a multiple choice type of environment. So in terms of the risk profile of your multiple choice or your objective response exams, Daniel, the risks can be managed in a number of ways. The first thing is to recognise that in any one particular exam, you know that there are going to be the questions will be equally weighted between all of the learning outcomes that are being assessed. So considering each of those learning outcomes and making sure that you've covered the content thoroughly in each of those learning outcomes will give you the grounding. The next thing you need to think about is the questions and how you can approach the questions themselves. And there's a number of different strategies that you may want to take to mitigate that risk. The first one is to look at the model answers or the questions that are on the CIPS website, and that gives you a sense of the sorts of questions that are asked within any one particular module. But do you know what? The most important thing is actually to create your own questions and actually use the study materials that you've got, Daniel, to create your own questions, and in so doing you will actually understand and know the content much more thoroughly, which will give you the grounding that you need in order to face up to your exams and do well. Now, students that I've taught in the past have actually got together in groups and tested each other on these types of things, and created questions for each other and created a kind of tennis game in order to try and practice the recall necessary within those objective response areas. And one last thing, Daniel, there is an ebook full of exam type questions available on the CIPS website as well. The points you make, yes, the pass mark is 70%, and 68% is fail. Yep, it is a pass or fail, and it is important that our learners doing a professional qualification know a good proportion of the content in order to pass. I will send the ebook link to Anna, and she will, hopefully Anna, you would be kind enough to send that out to colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, that's really useful advice. Thank you so much for that, Fiona. We will, if there aren't any more questions, we'll end the webinar now just before 2 p.m. We'll send out the recording and the presentation slides to you all in the next few days. And then if you do have any other questions, or you are interested in studying a CIPS course with us, I'll put some useful links in the chat for everyone. As Fiona was saying, CIPS provide procurement and supply qualifications that are internationally recognised and look great on your CV as really concrete kind of experience and qualifications proving that you are kind of excellent in your field, really. So if you are interested, please do get in touch and we'll be more than happy to help. Unless anyone has any more questions, we will end it there now. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined this afternoon, and thank you especially to Fiona for that wonderful presentation. That was really useful and interesting. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the day.